Hello everyone, this is Al-Fadi. Welcome back to this brand new series that we are titling In Search of a Place. That, of course, we're talking about Mecca here. And last time we gave an introduction to the series and why it's going to be an exciting one. Today we're going to kick it off really by taking a deep dive into what we call the importance of Mecca. Now we're going to focus, of course, all the time on what is the standard Islamic narrative, and then from time to time, as time permits, as the subject matter permits, as the content permits, we will push back against that standard Islamic narrative. With me here in studio is Dr. J. Dr. J, thank you so much, as always, for this exciting work. Tell us more about the standard Islamic narrative when it comes to Mecca and its importance.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to see why is it that Mecca is so important on the world stage. Why is Mecca so important for Muslims today? And to know why it's important for Muslims today, we need to go back to the past. We need to go back to the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th century. Probably not the 7th, because we don't have any narrative in the 7th.
And of course, I mean, for me, I know these things. We want it for the benefit of those who are watching.
This is what you grew up with.
Exactly.
And to be fair, this is what everybody grew up with, even those of us in the West. The Standard Islamic Narrative, SIN, has been the narrative that we've had to deal with, that we've been indoctrinated with. It's the only narrative that we've been given permission to use until now. And we're saying that Standard Islamic Narrative is not really at all from the 7th century. It's from the 8th, 9th, and 10th century. So you might want to say, call it the Standard Abbasid Narrative. SAN, S-A-N.
Right.
Or Standard Abbasid Description, S-A-D, SAD. Right. Because it's obvious that the Standard Islamic Narrative has real claims on Mecca. They have to. So let's look at them. Let's go to the slide. The first thing we see is that Mecca, they claim, is the oldest and best known city in history. What do they mean by that? Well, it's where Adam and Eve were. Now, if Adam and Eve were sent down to Mecca, the story, according to the traditions, according to Hadith, they were both up in the Garden of Eden, which is up in space. It's not the Garden of Eden that we have in the Bible.
That's right. That's right. It was in heaven.
It's in heaven.
Yeah.
They ate of the fruit. Very similar story to what we have, except their fruit is up in space, our fruit is on earth. And because they ate of the fruit, they were then forgiven for it. But oddly and ironically, they were still thrown out of the Garden of Eden. Why were they thrown out of the Garden of Eden?
Them and Satan, by the way.
And that means that we are all imputed with Adam and Eve's sin. I've never seen a Muslim that can answer that response. Okay. When I say, listen, you don't like original sin, you're always saying, how could one man be responsible for another man's sin? How could we be responsible for Adam and Eve's sin? Well, then why are you up in space? And
I did an entire video series on this, by the way, about the original sin and how these passages actually confirm what the Bible teaches about it.
So, Adam and Eve, the first man, the first woman, thrown out of the Garden of Eden, down. According to tradition, Eve, whoever threw them down didn't aim very well.
They were separated.
Eve got thrown down to Mecca, and Adam got thrown way down to Kerala in India. Not very good shots. And according to the traditions, Adam then gets up. He's 90 feet tall, and he just strides up from Kerala all the way up, it must be thousands of miles, up to Mecca, and rejoins his wife there in Mecca. So why? Because that's the only place that exists for humans.
And they met at that mount, by the way, Mount Arafat, meaning the place of unity and knowing each other again, and so on and so forth.
So Mount Arafat is where you have to see all these pilgrims. You've been there.
That's right.
It used to be right next to you, not too far away from where you used to live. So you know about Arafat. You've been up on top of Mount Arafat. So that's where they met. And so this suggests to me that this is the oldest town inhabitant in the history of mankind.
Right. I mean, it should be the first.
It is, because you can't have a town unless there's people.
Right.
So it's the first town, the first inhabitant, the first settlement, the first place for all of mankind. Hugely important, okay? Which means, what year are we given? We don't know. I mean, it could be thousands, it could be tens of thousands, it could be, depending on where you stand on short time or long time theory. Now let's go to what else we know. Surah 21, in chapter 21, verse 51 to 71, is a delightful story of Abraham. He's there it doesn't say Mecca. Remember, none of these places say Mecca. They only say the place of the prophet. So he's there in the place of the prophet, the Masjid al-Haram, and he goes and he destroys all the idols that are in the Masjid al-Haram. The next morning, the people see it. They get angry with him. They take him, they put him into a fiery pit. Abraham in a fiery pit? Do you remember Abraham being in a fiery pit in the biblical context?
Not at all. I mean, we know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego,
right,
in a fiery pit. Yeah.
Seem to have confused those two stories. We know why, because it's right there in the Mishnah of Rabbah. The Mishnah of Rabbah has the exact same account, which is a Jewish apocryphal account that you have Abraham doing in chapter 21 is from the Mishnah of Rabbah, from the 2nd century Jewish document.
And if I may just clarify, I mean, for those of you who do not know maybe the background behind what Dr. J is saying, in the Quran there is a story that Abraham supposedly was disturbed by the fact that his father and his town were worshippers of idols. He took basically, an offense to that. And one day, everybody came to the temple to worship these idols. They noticed that all of them have been broken down, with the exception to the chief idol has an axe next to him. And they knew right away that he's the troublemaker because he's the one who'd been antagonistic against him. Ask him, did you do this? He said, no. Ask the chief, he'll answer you. And they said, well, wait a minute, he's an idol, doesn't speak. And he's like, you prove my point. So that's the whole thing. So they throw him in the fiery pit.
I didn't hear that in Sunday school. That's not a story that I grew up with for a very good reason.
Yeah.
It's a Jewish apocryphal account. We even know who wrote it. We know when it was written, the 2nd century AD. And so that's why it gets lifted and put into the Quran in chapter 21. Nonetheless, Abraham, there in Mecca, 1900 or 2000 BC, roughly that time period. So 2,000 years before Jesus came, 4,000 years ago, there's Abraham in Mecca. Is that what we have been told? Did Abraham ever live in Mecca? Did Abraham ever live in the Hijaz, according to the biblical account?
From the biblical account, of course not. Abraham has always been in the promised land territory. I mean, it's been very clear. In fact, the Bible, in the story of Abraham, goes to the extreme of giving you geographical locations, naming towns and areas and territories. It's almost like the God of the Bible wants you to know that this is where he was living. When he went to Egypt, it says he went to Egypt, telling you where he went. How come he didn't say he went south to Arabia? How come he didn't say that,
We know he was in the Ur of the Chaldees. We know he went to Haran. We can put that on a map. We know where the Ur of the Chaldees is. That's in southern Iraq. Haran, we know where that is. That's in southern Turkey.
North and came down.
Then he came down over to Canaan, which is, we know where that is. That is in Israel. Right. You just look at a map and you can see where these three places are. Right. So we know nobody disputes where he went. None of these places are down in Arabia. That's 600 miles to 1,000 miles away from Arabia.
Amen.
So you can see there's a real problem with that historical. We're going to get into that a little later. But according to what the Muslims claim, that is Abraham. He's down in Mecca. He rebuilds the Kaaba. And then, of course, this great, delightful story of destroying the idols that were there and then being thrown into a fiery pit. So, thirdly, we are told that Mecca is the center of all trade. That it's north, south, east, and west. That's why it got its prominence. That's why it was made famous. Because all the trade coming from Aden went up through Mecca on the way up to Gaza in the north. Mm-hmm. All the trade that was coming from Africa, coming across, going, and from the Mediterranean, came down to Mecca and then went across the desert somehow, I don't know how, going over to India, or all the trade coming from India and from China in the east, coming across, would come through Mecca and go through Aden. This is the trade route theory. We're going to talk about that. Montgomery Watt's trade route theory. And then was redirected across the Arabian Sea from Aden all to Sana'a, to Najran, to Taif, then down to Mecca, then back up to Yathrib, up to Tabuk, Khaybar, then on up to Gaza in the north. This is the trade route theory that we're going to get into. That's and right. We're going to unpack. So this is what the Muslims have always claimed. And nobody's ever doubted before, right?
Yeah, Surah Quraysh in the Quran does talk about that, Rihlatu Shita'i was Sayf, meaning the journey during the fall and the journey during the summer, technically speaking, indicating that there was a trade path going through Mecca, going north and south.
So, obviously, from everything we're looking at, it should be one of the best known, best documented places on earth, right? If you look at, from the very beginning of time, Mecca's been there. From the time of Abraham, 1900 to 2000 BC, Mecca was there. All the trade, north, south. If all this trade is going through the city, someone should have known about it. Someone should have written about it. It should be all over the place. We should have all kinds of documents on it. We should have all kinds of history about it. We should have all kinds of people speaking about it. Do we? Not one thing. We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that.
That's right.
That's just to put it. Let's go and see what else they say. Well, let's look at the next slide. It's the center of Islam. It's the center of history, Muslims tell us. What do they mean by that? Now, I'm just putting these things up there. You can see them going back up the screen. These are the claims they make that come out of the Quran. Notice every one of these claims in the Quran, not one of them does it say the word Mecca. Just be careful. There's no reference to the word Mecca in the Quran itself except in chapter 48, verse 24. That's it.
Mecca by name, and there is another reference that is claimed to be Mecca, even though it says Becca, and that's
Becca.
an interesting one.
That's in chapter 3,
Right.
verse 96. Now here we have, so it's the first sanctuary pointing to the mankind was at Becca, chapter 3, verse 96 that you're referring to there. That's could be Mecca, maybe not Mecca, but you know that in Arabic, Becca and Mecca have three completely different radicals, don't they? Well, not three, but two different radicals.
Let's say that there is a Becca Valley north,
and we know where that is
leading
today.
to the Promised
That's in
Land.
Lebanon.
Exactly.
We know about Becca. The Becca Valley is in the
Bekaa
Bible.
Valley, yeah.
So they would say that this is Mecca. Okay, you're pushing it grammatically speaking, and also historically speaking, and also geographically speaking. I would not accept that. Nonetheless, that's what Muslims, they got to find it. They're going to claim for it. It's the mother of all settlements, according to chapter 6, verse 92, and chapter 42, verse 7. It's where Adam and Eve were thrown to, as we said already in chapter 7, verse 24. It's where Abraham was rebuilding the Kaaba, in chapter 21, verse 51 to 71. It's where Muhammad was born, according to the Standard Islamic Narrative, according to the Sirah of the Prophet, the Sirah of the Prophet, which is written by Ibn Hisham in 833. That's where he lived until 622. So from 570 up to 622, for the first 52 years of his life, he lived there in Mecca. And it was the center of all the Qiblas. When the Qibla was canonized in chapter 2, verse 149 to 150, you have the canonization in the Quran there of it, redirecting it down to, it doesn't say Mecca again, it just says the Masjid al-Haram. What is the interpretation of Masjid al-Haram?
Al-Masjid al-Haram, meaning it's the area of the holy mosque, the the sanctified area, technically speaking, prohibited from being attacked during the holy months. Respect is expected over there, dealing with the holiness of God in there, and so on and so forth. Not to be desecrated, if you wish.
Okay, so this is a pretty significant place.
Right.
If it is the mother of all settlements, Adam and Eve, Abraham, Muhammad was there, the Qibla were all facing there. So the Qibla, that would have been canonized about 624. So all the Qiblas from every mosque from 624 on are all facing Mecca, is what the claim is.
Right.
Yet we only find one reference in the Quran. All these references supposedly about Mecca, yet there's only one reference in Arabic that we can see that's called Mecca, and that's in chapter 48, verse 24. Why, if it's so important, do you only have one reference to it?
Yeah, and I know that the pushback Muslims say, well, wait a minute, all the other references is about Mecca. Okay, let me ask you this question, my dear Muslim. If you were to give these passages to a brand new Muslim right now, just converted to Islam, and tell him, find me Mecca, do you think they're going to go there and find Mecca there? They're going to only logically look for the name Mecca and find it there.
Okay, so even the Quran seems to suggest there is a place. So let's bring up the screen on and let's look what else it says. Now let's look what the traditions say. So when we look at the tradition, according to the Quran and the traditions, what we know is that it's the place of the Prophet, but it's in a valley and a parallel valley. That's Ibn Hisham says this, so does Al-Bukhari. We see that there's a stream going through it, according to Al-Bukhari again. Outside it, there are ruins, this pillar of salt, possibly the pillar of salt of Lot's wife, who's turned into a pillar of salt. That's in chapter 37. It has fields. We see this in Al-Bukhari again, the tradition, the hadith. It has trees, according to Tirmidhi. It has grass, according to Al-Bukhari. It has fruit. Al-Bukhari says that as well. And Al-Tabari talks about it has clay and loam. And then we get back to the Quran, and in chapter 6 and also chapter 16 and chapter 80, it talks about olive trees there in Mecca with mountains overlooking the Kaaba. Ibn Hisham talks about this. Al-Bukhari talks about this. So when you look at this, there's an awful lot of vegetation there in Mecca. When you just look at all these references, the problem is all these references talk about a place that's pretty fertile. Take a look at Mecca. Look at any picture of Mecca, not just today. Look at the ancient pictures of Mecca, and you will see that there is no vegetation in that part of the world at all. It was a desert place. It was a barren place. It didn't have any water. That's why people are querying this, saying, what are they referring to? This can't be Mecca.
I'm not aware of any olive that came from Mecca. I mean, it would have been probably the top seller. I mean, Zamzam water is a top seller because it comes from Mecca. Dates, we have a lot of date in Saudi. It's a top seller. How come we don't have a single reference to olive that came from there? And we know olive existed around Jerusalem and it still exists till this day in that region.
Olives actually come from the Mediterranean, which is 600 miles further north. So all of this is problematic. This is hugely problematic. But it's not me saying this. These are the traditions that are saying it and the Qur'an that's saying it. Now, what I want to do next is I want to go and look at all the people that are buried in Mecca according to the traditions.
And I think everyone is starting to pick on that. We're showing the standard Islamic narrative, and yet we are challenging that narrative, as we should, because we're using, take a look at this episode, hopefully you can rewind it if you want. We've used Islamic references, Quranic references, Islamic sources. We're not coming up with our own opinion. We're saying the sources itself poses a problem. If a city has such an importance, how come it's only mentioned once by the correct name, Mecca? Why is that? Why isn't it mentioned in exactly multiple times? Look at Jerusalem and how many times it's mentioned in the Bible, for instance, compared to Mecca. And the list can go on and on and on. So that's why we're excited about this brand new series, In Search of a Place. Of course, we're talking about Mecca. And we are still building a foundation based on the Islamic narrative. But of course, towards the end, we are going to debunk those claims, and we will show now the problem with those claims in relationship to that place. Of course, it's important because there is a book, there is a man, and there is a place when you're dealing with Islam. And it's no other than Dr. J, who is good at debunking the book, the man, and now we're debunking the place. Thank you, Dr. J. Thank you, everyone. And until we meet again next time, have a blessed day.